This is the most important possession in John's life. He sleeps with it, works with it, and travels with it. It's always in his pocket or by his side. It connects him to everything he values. He uses it to stay in constant touch with his friends and family. He immerses himself in the video and music he loves and escapes the world of strangers. He boosts his self-esteem with it, and he achieves success at work with it. John's smartphone is central to his identity, his being. It's the mirror in which he sees himself and the lens through which he sees the world. He thinks and feels with it. It perhaps even knows him better than he knows himself. So integrated with his being is it that John struggles to cope without it. Whenever it runs out of battery, John feels disoriented, disconnected, and discombobulated. The world suddenly feels alien. John doesn't really feel himself, nor know exactly what he should be doing. Such feelings have been magnified on the few occasions when the phone has been lost or broken. This was an experience tantamount to grief. John was one of the participants in my PhD research on smartphones. He's in his 20s and lives in London, but I think his account represents the kind of relationship that most of us have with our smartphones, regardless of our age or location. Certainly, it's become incredibly important to everyday life. It's not hyperbole to suggest that the smartphone is a seminal moment in the history of technology. Certainly, there have been technologies that have had a greater impact on health and happiness. Yet there is something the smartphone has done that no other technology has even come close to doing. That is, achieving intimacy with us. The smartphone is not just physically intimate with us, it's spiritually, existentially, and emotionally intimate as well. Seemingly, it's perfectly in tune with the rhythms of our lives and the fibres of our being. For most of us, it's the centre of our universe. Given the smartphone's importance and potential influence over our being, it should really generate fierce debate. We should be asking, what are the implications for identity, for politics, and for freedom? These implications may well be considerable. However, the debate is depressingly limp. In academia, little social science research on smartphones is being conducted. In the media, in recent years, we've seen debates on the smartphone's influence on things like surveillance, the mental health of children, and social interaction. Yet, whilst these are really important, their scope is quite narrow. So why the lack of interest? Well, one crucial reason is that our understanding of the smartphone has been shaped by one idea that's seemingly so dominant, so incontestable, that it shuts down debate before it's even started. This is the smartphone as liberator. The roots of this idea go back to long before the smartphone was even conceived, to the 1960s counterculture and figures like Stuart Brand. Appalled by the deadening conformity instilled by the technology of the time and influenced by philosophers like Ayn Rand and Norbert Wiener, Brand and others started to imagine a new, more positive role for technology. These ideas influenced the nascent Silicon Valley, and by the 1980s resulted in the attempt to reconcile two apparently contradictory positions, those of the bohemian and the yuppie. From the bohemian, they took an emphasis on romantic individualism and authenticity. From the yuppie, they took capitalism and the profit motive. This synthesis has been called the Californian ideology, and it's one of the most influential ideologies of our time. In fact, its influence is demonstrated by the fact that we no longer view its core assumptions as radical, but as entirely natural. In the 1960s, it was assumed that the individual and capitalism were opposed. Today, however, we believe not just that they can be reconciled, but that they are complementary. In large part, this is because of the success of technologies that seem to embody this synthesis. The personal computer and cyberspace are two key examples. But in my view, the ultimate example is the smartphone. At the heart of the cultural understanding of the smartphone is a radical individualism. It promises the Enlightenment and liberal fantasy of autonomy, and the romantic fantasy of authenticity. The basis of such claims is the idea that the smartphone allows you to live within your very own personal universe. The world of the smartphone is a world of things that are personally meaningful: friends, family, music, games. The smartphone creates this world and you create it, shaping it according to your preferences. The smartphone also promises a sense of mastery over modern life. Modern existence is fragmented, confusing, and often overwhelming. Yet the smartphone gives us a sense of control by bringing life together in the comforting simplicity of the menu screen. And perhaps most importantly of all, it offers a powerful fantasy of mobility. The smartphone creates weightless existence. It removes us from our surrounds, transporting us to other times and places, such as in mediated co-presence with our loved ones. But if the smartphone promises us a new individualism, it's an individualism that takes place within the marketplace, not outside it. The logic is that it's only via capitalism that one can be a truly realized individual. And it's only through the smartphone that the individual, capitalism, and technology come together to make this possible. Thus, in the smartphone, we see the perfect synthesis of the bohemian and the yuppie. We see this in the new relationships with work the smartphone creates. Not only does the smartphone connect us to work 24/7, it also spreads the ideology of personal productivity through productivity apps and organizational tools. The implicit claim here is individual empowerment. The smartphone allows us to be more productive workers, allowing us to get ahead. And consider consumption. With the smartphone, we are connected to marketplaces for commodities and services 24/7. We can now order products in seconds or access services from the on-demand economy, a new marketplace designed specifically for the smartphone. So here, individual freedom is associated with an instant mobile relationship with the marketplace. There are many more examples, but I think the point is now clear. The freedom the smartphone offers is unashamedly capitalist. Nevertheless, this might sound wonderful. All the fruits of capitalism whilst being a free individual, the best of both worlds. However, is this utopia of the smartphone actually a reality? Judging by the accounts of many of the ordinary smartphone users I interviewed, it seems not. Within these accounts, there is a profound ambivalence towards the smartphone. Many extolled its virtues, representing it as the liberator. Yet, many of the same participants also painted a rather darker picture. They spoke of new obligations, the perils of being available 24/7, fears of dependency and addiction, and a possible loss of perspective on what's meaningful. Let's consider the example of Sarah. Prior to the interview, Sarah completed a collage on the theme of what her smartphone meant to her. Many parts of the collage express the idea of the smartphone as liberator. It allows a fast response, relaxation, and control. But there's also this image, the idea of being handcuffed to the phone. Sarah spoke here of the inability to escape the obligations of work and friends. This image, or variants of it, also appeared in many other accounts. At this point, the idea of the smartphone as liberator starts to seem suspect. It's based on the idea that the goals of capitalism and the quest for individual freedom are in perfect alignment. It's clear that for many of my participants, reality is rather more complex. They have detected subtle, unseen forces that constrain rather than enable their freedom. I want to propose an alternative perspective from the one that the ideologues of Silicon Valley have seduced us with. In the new perspective, the smartphone shapes and controls us in order to integrate us into capitalism. Capitalism is driven by the needs to make the accumulation process as efficient as possible. In pursuit of this aim, it must ensure maximum compliance from the population. It therefore nullifies resistance and develops techniques that ensure people work for its interests. These techniques we can call mechanisms of control. Historically, the factory has been one such mechanism. To ensure their compliance, the factory imposed rigid patterns of discipline on workers. Such forms of discipline included surveillance by colleagues, rigidly defined tasks, and time. According to E.P. Thompson, the imposition of clock time involving the standardization of the working day was key to ensuring compliance. Mass consumption is another mechanism. In the classic Frankfurt School account, the delights of consumption are a way of compensating the masses for the drudgery of work. This ensures their compliance with an alienating system. Furthermore, in the logic of consumption, a product goes out of fashion just as you've bought it, compelling you to consume more. You become tied to endless cycles of desire, ensuring no escape from consumption. But today, many of the mechanisms of control of the past are crude and ineffective. Culturally, we live in an age of irony and skepticism, and thus reject overt forms of control. Furthermore, contemporary work is stereotypically mobile and flexible, and takes place within the knowledge economy. Thus, something like the factory is just no longer relevant. Yet, as the French philosopher Gilles Deleuze warned us back in 1993, mechanisms of control have not ended. Instead, capitalism invents new, more subtle ones. The smartphone is the paradigmatic mechanism of control for a capitalism based on flexibility and mobility. Its effectiveness rests on two features. The first is the simple fact that it's with us at all times. Whilst many mechanisms of control of the past could only influence us at certain times of day, the smartphone can influence us 24/7. The second feature relates to the level of existence at which the smartphone controls us. In the case of the factory, for example, the worker is controlled at the level of his body. However, his mind may be largely untouched. The smartphone, by contrast, exerts control at the level of the mind or the self. It taps the fibres and rhythms of our being. This means its control is much more subtle and difficult to detect. It also makes it much more powerful, since it can reshape us at the foundational level of existence. Thus, capitalism has at its disposal the ultimate tool to turn us into ideal consumers and producers. We can now define smartphone capitalism. Smartphone capitalism is a capitalism in which our thoughts, identity, and behaviour are moulded by our smartphones to make us more compliant producers and consumers. We therefore live within a dangerous new era of control in which the very fibres of our being are colonized. But does this just mean that we're cultural dopes who have been seduced by our phones? Is the sense of freedom they give us just an illusion? No, and to argue that would be simplistic. It would take us into the realm of conspiracy theories or a naive Marxism. To borrow a metaphor from the media theorist Michael Arnold, the smartphone has a Janus face. Janus was a Roman god with two faces. He looked both ways, and so does the smartphone. It looks both to freedom and control. The metaphor allows us to see that the smartphone always has paradoxical effects. It liberates us and dominates us simultaneously. One of the implications of this is that the freedom the smartphone gives us is real. However, it's also weak. That's because the smartphone controls us at the same time. Put differently, it liberates us in ways that make us more useful to capitalism. We are not free from capitalism. Quite the opposite. Our freedom is to be better producers and consumers. If this all seems rather abstract, let me try to make it more tangible. Each of the next 6 videos will try to develop the Janus face metaphor in relation to a specific aspect of life with the smartphone. I'll focus on things like productivity, self-branding, moving around the city, self-optimization, and sociality. Then there'll be videos that will explore further the nature of freedom in smartphone capitalism and start to think what a world beyond smartphone capitalism would look like. The releases will be spread out over several months, so do subscribe to the channel for notifications. So, the world of smartphone capitalism, a world of euphoria and melancholia, mobility and constraint, empowerment and obligation, a world of dizzying complexity, but nevertheless one that's imperative to understand. After all, freedom and truth are at stake. Our perspective has been distorted for too long.